It was the winter of 1942. The North Atlantic was a graveyard of steel and oil, where the endless battle for control of the sea decided the fate of nations. Nazi Germany's U-boats prowled beneath the waves like predators in the dark, striking with deadly precision. Every ship that vanished beneath the cold water meant one more breath stolen from Britain's lifeline: food, fuel, and hope itself. But in a dimly lit room somewhere in London, a different kind of battle was unfolding. Around a table cluttered with maps, reports, and coded messages, a handful of officers and scientists were planning something extraordinary, an operation so secret that even its own crew wouldn't know the full truth. On paper, it looked like an ordinary supply convoy bound for the Arctic route to the Soviet Union. In reality, it carried the seed of a deception that could turn the tide of the Atlantic War. They called it Operation PQ-17, though later history would remember a different name: the Ghost Convoy. Hidden within this fleet was not just cargo, but an experiment in electronic warfare, counterintelligence, and psychological trickery. The goal was simple yet daring: to make the German Navy believe they were seeing ghosts, phantom ships that existed only on their radar screens and in their coded messages. No one outside a small circle of intelligence officers knew the full extent of the plan. Even among the British Admiralty, it was spoken of in whispers. Somewhere in those frozen waters, a silent duel between technology, fear, and human ingenuity was about to begin. While the icy winds of the Atlantic howled over steel decks and frozen waves, another war, a quieter, more invisible one, was being fought hundreds of miles inland, inside the damp rooms of Bletchley Park. There, a small army of mathematicians, linguists, and engineers worked day and night to crack the Nazi Enigma code, a cipher so complex that the Germans believed it to be unbreakable. Yet for the British, breaking Enigma was not enough. They wanted to go further, to control the narrative of what the Germans thought they were seeing. Among the codebreakers was a group of radar engineers who had begun experimenting with a new kind of deception. Their idea was almost unbelievable for its time. If you could manipulate radio waves, you could create phantom signals, false blips, that appeared to be entire fleets of ships. With the right equipment, they believed they could make the ocean itself lie. This was the birth of what would later be known as Operation Glimmer, though in this early stage, it existed only as a series of sketches and hastily written memos marked top secret. In early 1942, as German U-boats sank ship after ship, a plan began to take form. Using modified radar transponders and carefully timed transmissions, the British would make it appear as if a large convoy was moving through the North Atlantic, far from where the real ships were sailing. The fake convoy would transmit radio chatter, Morse code conversations, navigational beacons, even distress signals, all designed to sound convincingly human. To the German listening posts and U-boat commanders, it would seem as if an entire fleet had materialized out of nowhere. The brains behind the plan included officers from the Admiralty's Intelligence Division and scientists from the Telecommunications Research Establishment. Their collaboration was unprecedented. Scientists accustomed to laboratories now found themselves studying naval maps, weather reports, and the behavioral patterns of U-boat wolf packs. Every detail mattered. If the fake signals appeared too regular, the Germans would suspect deception. If they appeared too random, the illusion would fall apart. Timing was everything. Meanwhile, in the Arctic ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, the Soviets were desperate for supplies: tanks, trucks, and food from Britain and the United States. The convoy system was their lifeline, but each new mission risked disaster under the relentless U-boat attacks. The British Admiralty knew that a single successful deception could save thousands of lives and hundreds of ships. That urgency drove them forward. To make the illusion complete, a small number of real ships would sail, old, expendable freighters retrofitted with strange antenna arrays and radar reflectors. Their purpose was not to reach a destination, but to be seen. They would broadcast decoy messages and send back manipulated radar echoes, confusing any U-boat that got close. The true convoy, carrying vital cargo to the Soviet Union, would sail hundreds of miles to the south, under the cloak of this elaborate ruse. Even within the British ranks, few believed it would work. "You can't trick the sea," one naval officer reportedly said. "It gives up every secret eventually." But others, especially those who had seen the success of earlier deception operations in North Africa, insisted it could be done. They pointed out that the Germans had grown overconfident in their technology. They trusted their signals and intelligence so completely that they had stopped questioning what they saw. And that, the British knew, was where their opportunity lay. As spring turned to summer, the preparations intensified. Engineers tested the transmitters in the dead of night, sending false echoes across the channel to see how far they could be detected. Intelligence officers drafted fake logs and coded messages that would later be intercepted by German spies. Every step of the plan was rehearsed with meticulous care. By May 1942, the operation was ready to move from theory to action. The Germans would soon detect what appeared to be one of the largest convoys ever assembled, a massive fleet heading north toward the icy waters between Greenland and Norway. They would mobilize their submarines, aircraft, and surface raiders to intercept it. But when they arrived, there would be nothing there, just empty ocean and echoes in the dark. The stage was set for one of the strangest and most daring acts of deception in the entire war, a battle fought not with guns or torpedoes, but with illusion, mathematics, and pure nerve. In the early hours of June 27, 1942, a thick fog rolled across the Scottish coast. From above, the sea looked like a sheet of shifting silver, broken only by the faint outlines of ships slowly taking formation. To anyone watching, it seemed like another standard convoy preparing for the long, dangerous passage to the Arctic. But appearances were everything, and this one was carefully designed to deceive. The convoy that gathered in those early morning hours was no ordinary fleet. Of the 22 ships seen leaving the port of WWII, nearly half carried no critical supplies at all. Some were old merchant vessels stripped of valuable cargo and fitted instead with radar reflectors, large metallic structures designed to bounce and distort radio waves, making them appear on radar screens as much larger targets. A few had entire decks covered with canvas dummy tanks and crates, purely for reconnaissance photographs. But the real innovation was invisible. Below decks, engineers had installed secret transmitters and coded radio systems. These devices would send out pre-recorded Morse chatter, fragments of fake communication between non-existent ships. Each transmission was timed to mimic the rhythm and confusion of real fleet radio. Operators even inserted deliberate mistakes and corrections to make the signals feel authentic. Farther out to sea, small trawlers and patrol craft played supporting roles. Their job was to move in looping patterns, generating the illusion of additional ships on radar. To the German High Command, monitoring signals from occupied Norway and the French coast, the picture was unmistakable, a massive Allied convoy pushing north through the Atlantic, rich with targets. Meanwhile, the real PQ convoy, the one carrying tanks, planes, ammunition, and desperately needed supplies to the Soviet Union, slipped quietly along a different route, far to the south. Only a handful of officers knew both paths. To everyone else, even within the Allied command structure, the deception remained a mystery, wrapped in routine orders. For the sailors aboard the decoy ships, it was a strange mission. They knew they were bait, though few understood just how deep the deception ran. Every time they sent a coded burst over the airwaves, they were helping to build a phantom fleet, a ghost armada designed to die if necessary, so that others might live. The officers drilled their crews in silence protocols, emergency maneuvers, and evacuation procedures. Every man knew the risk. If the Germans took the bait too well, the convoy could be attacked before the illusion achieved its purpose. By the third night at sea, the deception began to take hold. German listening stations in Bergen and Trondheim intercepted the ghost convoy's radio chatter. Naval intelligence analysts logged the increasing traffic and noted the consistency of signal strength, a sure sign, they thought, of a large, steady-moving fleet. Within 24 hours, Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, had redirected several wolf packs to intercept what he believed was a major Allied convoy. The U-boats fanned out across the North Atlantic, hunting. They sent back excited reports, sonar pings, radar echoes, even what some described as visual confirmations of distant silhouettes against the fog. None of it was real. The reflections came from radar baffles and chaff, strips of metallic foil dropped into the sea to confuse instruments. Some U-boat crews even fired torpedoes into the mist, claiming hits on ships that didn't exist. In London, inside a small war room beneath the Admiralty, intelligence officers watched the intercepts with growing astonishment. The Germans had taken the bait completely. They're chasing shadows, one officer whispered as decoded messages came in describing an engagement that had never happened. Dönitz believed his submarines had scattered the Allied convoy. In truth, they were dozens of miles away from the real target, burning precious fuel and revealing their positions with every transmission. For nearly a week, the illusion held. The ghost convoy transmitted its signals at carefully planned intervals, always suggesting movement, now northeast, now due east, leading the German submarines farther from the real ships. Allied aircraft occasionally flew over the decoy route, dropping small explosive charges to simulate depth charge attacks and reinforce the illusion of battle. The ocean itself became part of the act, its fog and storms lending realism to the unseen theater of war. Yet not everything went smoothly. On the fifth night, one of the decoy ships suffered a mechanical failure. Her engines faltered, and she began drifting out of formation. A distress signal risked exposing the deception, so the crew had to remain silent while another vessel towed her back under cover of darkness. Every hour brought new danger, from weather, from detection, and from the constant tension of pretending to be what they were not. Still, the operation continued. The British codebreakers monitored German communications relentlessly, ensuring the illusion never cracked. When one U-boat reported unusual radar interference, the intelligence team immediately adapted the transmission pattern to match what the Germans expected from large convoys under attack. Every action had a counteraction, every deception a defense. By early July, as the real supply convoy neared the safety of Soviet waters, the Ghost Fleet's purpose had been fulfilled. The U-boats, spread thin and running low on fuel, were forced to return to their bases. For the first time in months, an Allied convoy had crossed the Arctic without catastrophic losses. The cost of that victory, though, was measured in secrecy and silence. Few of those who had sailed with the Phantom ships ever received recognition for what they had done. Their mission had officially never happened. But history would remember it, quietly, as the first large-scale use of radar and radio deception at sea, a battle fought in the static of the airwaves and the fog of the North Atlantic, where shadows could kill and ghosts could save lives. By mid-July 1942, the cold waters of the North Atlantic were calm again. The fog had lifted, the false radio signals had gone silent, and the convoy that had stirred the German Navy into frantic action had simply vanished. What remained were scattered reports, confused, contradictory, and increasingly embarrassing to the Kriegsmarine Command. U-boat captains swore they had seen the silhouettes of ships, heard explosions, and even claimed confirmed kills, yet no wreckage was ever found. No oil slicks, no floating debris, nothing. Inside the dark-paneled war offices in Berlin, Admiral Karl Dönitz pored over the intercepts. Something was wrong. The reports from his submarine captains did not add up. One U-boat had fired 3 torpedoes at what it believed was a freighter, reporting 2 solid hits, but sonar operators heard no breakup, no implosion. Another claimed to have sunk a destroyer, yet Allied radio traffic showed no sign of distress calls or rescue missions. For Dönitz, a man whose entire strategy relied on precision and efficiency, the inconsistencies were maddening. At first he blamed faulty equipment. Radar interference, atmospheric anomalies, and overzealous crews were convenient explanations. But as the days passed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The supposed convoy had produced no casualties for the Allies, no proof of damage, and no victory for the German Navy. Instead, it had lured multiple U-boats far from their hunting grounds, draining their fuel and exposing them to Allied reconnaissance aircraft. The breaking point came when Bletchley Park's codebreakers intercepted a high-level German message acknowledging the possibility of Allied radio falsifications. Though brief and heavily coded, it was the first time the Nazi High Command admitted, even privately, that they might have been tricked. Intelligence officers in London smiled when they read it. The ruse had not only worked, it had shaken German confidence in their own communications. For Dönitz and his staff, the implications were grim. Their most reliable tools, radio intelligence, radar detection, and encrypted communication, were no longer beyond manipulation. If the Allies could conjure an entire fleet out of thin air, what else might they be hiding? Were the real convoys where they seemed, or were they ghosts too? The psychological blow was severe. Within weeks, the German Navy issued new directives. All radar contacts were to be visually confirmed before attacks. Radio intercepts had to be verified by multiple sources. On paper, it seemed like a sensible reform. In practice, it slowed the U-boat operations drastically. Commanders became hesitant, second-guessing every signal and shadow. The element of speed and surprise, the essence of the Wolfpack strategy, began to erode. Meanwhile, in London, the architects of the deception observed the ripple effects with quiet satisfaction. The success of the Ghost Convoy wasn't measured in tonnage sunk or enemy losses. It was measured in doubt. The German Navy had been forced to question its own eyes and ears, and in warfare, doubt was as deadly as any weapon. But not everyone celebrated. Some in the British Admiralty worried that the ruse had worked too well. Deception, after all, was a double-edged sword. The Germans, now suspicious of their instruments, might respond with new levels of paranoia and brutality. If they couldn't trust their radar or intercepts, they might turn to more aggressive tactics, attacking anything that moved, civilian or military alike. For the men behind the plan, the line between victory and consequence had never been thinner. Far to the north, the sailors who had manned the decoy ships returned to port in silence. Their mission was never publicly acknowledged, and their ships, stripped of their strange antenna and radar reflectors, resumed ordinary service. Some of the crewmen spoke quietly of the eerie feeling of knowing they had fought an invisible battle, one of signals, echoes, and shadows, where survival depended not on gunnery or courage, but on how well they could pretend. And in the archives of the Admiralty, sealed under classification orders, the reports of Operation PQ-17 Deception were filed away. The world would not learn of the Ghost Convoy for decades. When historians finally pieced the story together after the war, it read almost like science fiction, yet it had happened, and it had changed the nature of warfare forever. Across Europe, German analysts were still trying to explain the impossible. How could ships exist one day and vanish the next? Some suspected new Allied technology, radar cloaking, or advanced jamming systems. Others believed in deliberate misinformation fed through captured spies. A few even whispered that the British had developed a way to bend radio waves themselves. The truth, of course, was simpler. The Germans had been fooled not by machines, but by human imagination, a combination of science, timing, and psychological manipulation, so effective that it rendered superior firepower useless. By the time the truth reached Dönitz in its full form, the damage was irreversible. The Kriegsmarine's faith in its intelligence network was broken, and in modern warfare, where information was the most precious weapon of all, that break was catastrophic. The North Atlantic had claimed thousands of lives, but in that strange, quiet summer of 1942, it had also witnessed something entirely new, a victory won without a single real battle by a fleet that never truly existed. In the years that followed, the story of the Ghost Convoy slipped quietly into the background of World War II history. It was too strange, too secret, and too deeply buried within classified files to attract attention at the time. But for those who had participated in it, the engineers at Bletchley Park, the radar operators at sea, the intelligence officers in London, its impact was unmistakable. What had begun as a desperate experiment in survival had opened the door to an entirely new dimension of warfare, the war of perception. For centuries, military strategy had depended on strength, on numbers, firepower, and logistics. But the Ghost Convoy had proved something radically different, that in the modern age, belief could be as powerful as bullets. If you could make your enemy believe in something that wasn't real, you could move ships, armies, and even nations without firing a shot. In the months after the operation, British intelligence expanded its research into radio deception. The lessons learned from the North Atlantic were applied again and again in North Africa, where fake tank divisions misled Rommel's forces, and later in Europe during the build-up to D-Day. The principles were always the same: control what the enemy sees, control what they fear, and you control what they do. The Ghost Convoy had been the first large-scale demonstration that such control was possible across the vastness of an ocean. The scientists who had worked on the project went on to shape the future of electronic warfare. Their crude radar jammers and signal replicators evolved into sophisticated countermeasure systems, the ancestors of what modern militaries would one day call electronic intelligence and stealth. To them, deception was not a trick, it was a science, the careful manipulation of signal, sound, and psychology to create an alternate reality in which the enemy acted against their own interests. For the German Navy, the consequences of that single deception continued to echo long after the war. The paranoia it planted within the U-boat command contributed to a gradual breakdown in operational confidence. Commanders who once trusted their instruments now hesitated, waiting for confirmation that never came. Convoys that might have been attacked were allowed to pass. Every flicker on a radar screen became suspect. The Allies had not only deceived their enemies once, they had taught them to doubt forever. When the war finally ended in 1945, the files on the Phantom convoy were still classified. The official record of PQ-17, the real convoy that reached Soviet ports with far fewer losses than expected, said nothing about the deception that had shielded it. Only a handful of names appeared in the documents: naval officers, communications experts, and one or two anonymous engineers whose inventions had made the illusion possible. They received no medals, no mentions in the press. Their work was buried under the larger headlines of victory and peace. Decades later, when historians began unsealing wartime intelligence files, they found fragments, brief reports, radio logs, and experimental diagrams that hinted at the operation's scope. It was then that the true magnitude of the Ghost Convoy came into focus. What had seemed like a minor footnote in naval warfare was revealed as a turning point, the first successful use of large-scale electronic deception at sea. It had saved hundreds of lives and changed forever how wars would be fought. Even today, the echoes of that deception remain. Modern navies use digital versions of the same ideas: radar ghosts, signal decoys, and electromagnetic camouflage. The principles born out of desperation in 1942 have evolved into technologies that define the battlefields of the 21st century. Stealth aircraft, cyber warfare, and signal interference all trace a faint lineage back to that fog-shrouded convoy that sailed into the Atlantic, carrying nothing but air, hope, and illusion. Yet for all its technological legacy, perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Ghost Convoy is a human one. It is a story of minds, of how intelligence, creativity, and courage can reshape the course of a war without a single shot fired. It is a reminder that, even in the darkest years of World War II, victory did not always belong to those with the biggest guns or the most ships, but sometimes to those who understood the simplest truth of conflict, that what an enemy believes can be deadlier than what he sees. And so the Ghost Convoy faded into legend, a fleet that never truly existed, yet changed the very nature of warfare. Its ships sailed not through the water, but through the imagination of those who were deceived by it. And in that space between truth and illusion, between signal and silence, the course of history quietly shifted.